I'm Shannon Boyle. I work at headquarters in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our fisheries program, primarily coordinating our interagency fish passage task force that many of the other federal agency folks on this call are also involved in. But our coordinator is off, our actual coordinator for the program is off today, so I have her contact info at the end of this slide. This is by no means the only program within the service that funds work for habitat for brook trout, but this is the one that we're going to focus on today. So as many of you are likely familiar, the National Fish Passage Program has been around for decades at this point. It grew from a very small program to now a highly successful program that operates nationwide. So successful, in fact, that it received $200 million in the infrastructure law. The base appropriations for the program are typically these days around $18 million. Some of that funding goes to projects at a regional level, and some of that goes to support staff capacity and coordination on the ground. I'm going to talk primarily about our infrastructure law funding opportunity today, but just to touch a little bit on our base appropriations. These projects typically range, in $100,000 or less, depending on funding available at the regional level. A lot of this funding is actually going to staff capacity right now in support of our larger bill projects. But project development and priorities for our base appropriation funding occur kind of on an ongoing basis throughout the year. So if there is interest in tackling some smaller program or projects for brook trout improvement, feel free to reach out to your regional coordinator and chat about funding available there. Across both the infrastructure and our base appropriated funding, the National Fish Passage Program, for the most part, have the same eligibility requirements with just a little bit of a different scope and scale. It is a cooperative conservation program, as many of you know, likely, where we work primarily and only really with voluntary partners. And it really is very flexible in that we can work nationwide. We're not limited to land ownership types or specific habitats or specific species, and a lot of that is driven by the priorities at our regional level, and I'll get into that in a minute. In terms of application or applicant eligibility, any entity is eligible to receive funding under the program, and in terms of projects, the primary goal here is to either partially or completely eliminate a barrier to fish and aquatic species. So that may involve, full dam removals, culvert removals, or replacements, but also certain other kind of non-physical barriers, such as inadequate flows or water quality improvements. One of the things that we have funded historically to a lesser extent, and that we've really tried to improve more of and do more of with our infrastructure funding, is eligibility of our funding to phases outside of just project implementation. So at this point, we are our funding is eligible for all phases of projects, from early planning and feasibility stages through engineering and design to on the ground implementation and construction. And this also, it does include the capacity monitoring and outreach that is essential for successful fish passage projects. Our NFPP infrastructure law FY24 funding opportunity is available now. It was just released a couple weeks ago in October. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on primarily today. At a high level, our priorities have remained relatively consistent over the last 2 years of bill implementation and consistent with the program as a whole. They can really be lumped into big categories of ecological benefits, climate resilience, and community resilience, as well as co-benefits. So with this funding, we're really trying to benefit our priority species and habitats. In many cases, brook trout is one of those. Maintain and maximize sustainable aquatic connectivity, enhance community and species resilience to climate change. We're also really trying to improve our community resilience, not just our ecological resilience. And in many cases, that is done in partnership with our key partners, including tribes, states, and other stakeholders. We're also working to provide those co-benefits such as, transportation safety, reduced flood risk, job creation, increased recreation, many of these co-benefits that are achieved across the board with these fish passage projects and barrier removal projects. And some of the last ones, similar to what Jeff and Richard and Melanie were speaking to, a lot of this funding, we are a Justice 40 covered program. And so we are working to align our program priorities and criteria with providing benefits to disadvantaged communities according to CEQ. And then at a high level, we're working to achieve really these watershed scale benefits. And in so doing, we're really working to directly leverage other funding to create this transformational change across the landscape. These priorities, as you can see, really reflect directly to our selection criteria for our FY24 funding opportunity. All of this is outlined in the NOFO, and I'll provide that info later. These three big buckets, ecological benefits at 55 points is definitely our highest weighted criterion. This received a slight bump from our last year's criteria, primarily because of this regional and watershed context. We're giving additional weight to projects that really seek to implement aquatic ecosystem restoration on a large scale and work with partners in doing so. The other two kind of buckets of selection criteria are human community benefits, focusing on, achieving environmental justice, building community resilience to climate change. And then in addition, we don't have a specific tribal set aside, but we do provide additional prioritization and criteria selection to projects that are led by or partnered by tribes. And then finally, just a few additional kind of logistical constraints on leverage funding, community support, and project duration and timeline. So our application process definitely gets a little confusing sometimes given the collaborative nature. We're not a strict kind of open grant process where we have very clear due dates. So we try our best to make the process as clear as possible. For the most part, at a high level, projects and proposals are developed in collaboration with our FWS staff. And the first deadline is actually coming up in just over 2 weeks on November 17th, which is a letter of interest to your regional coordinator. If you're interested in submitting a proposal, a full proposal, the letter of interest is just a brief statement expressing that interest in seeking funding for the program. Then throughout the winter and spring, we have a regional and technical review and a national level review. Final approval of the projects lies with the service and DOI leadership, and we usually expect final projects announced in the spring of the following year. So in this case, it will be April or May in 2024. And then once those final projects are approved and announced, those applicants and those project proponents will then submit into our grant administration software, Grant Solutions, to actually receive their award. So just very briefly, our Northeast region and our Midwest Great Lakes region are the two that prioritize brook trout primarily across the service. The Southeast does a little bit of work, but it's less so a strict priority within the region. At a finer scale, at our Northeast and Midwest regions, there are kind of watershed scale prioritization schema that are used to direct funding more specifically. Both Region 5, or our Northeast region, and our Midwest region have these maps here, the SWIM map in Region 5 on the left, and the recently released watershed priorities in Region 3 on the right. And these prioritizations essentially can be used across FWS programs and by partners to really focus aquatic connectivity investments and achieve kind of a collective lift in these places, both for the ecosystem and the communities there. These watersheds are by no means the only places where our service regions spend funds or work, but it does help to further refine investments in these regions. Across the first 2 years of our infrastructure law funding in 2022 and 2023, we did fund 9 projects across 6 states that either directly or indirectly benefited brook trout. We've funded just over 70 projects in almost 40 states at this point. And given we are a national program, this is actually, a feat for brook trout, really driving a lot of this funding. It was actually a target species for 5 of the 9 projects that were funded, and the other 4 brook trout was kind of a secondary benefited species. This was a total amount of almost $8.5 million and leveraged over 8.5 by 8.6, just over 1-to-1 in partner funding. When completed, probably in the next several years, these 9 projects will reopen 568 stream miles and restore 330 acres of habitat by removing 38 in-stream barriers. And these are over the states of Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Hampshire, and West Virginia. So this is one just quick example, the Potomac Headwaters Restoration Project. This received $1.15 million in funding from our FY22 funding opportunity. This was our first year, one of the first projects we funded with our infrastructure law dollars. This was a critical partnership that had been in the works for quite a long time with TU and West Virginia. I'm sure many of the people in the room are very familiar, probably more familiar with this project than I am. This project directly benefits brook trout as well as American eel, and they're still putting together identifying some of the barriers that will be ultimately removed to reopen 150 square miles of a super patch for brook trout cold water refugia. And in addition, this project really focused a lot on those community co-benefits, a lot of public safety improvements, access to recreational areas, and kind of community revitalization in general. I will provide this info to Lori to distribute. This is just so you can find our NOFO easily. It's on grants.gov. Feel free to scan the QR code if you'd like to find it right now. I would just recommend reading it carefully, given the kind of deadlines and the way that the service works and the program works in the collaborative nature. Some things can get lost, but other than that, we're all here to help. And these are our national coordinator, Amy Horseman, our Northeast and our Midwest coordinators. One is acting and the other will be back mid-November. And feel free to reach out at any time. We're happy to take any questions. Sorry, Lori, that definitely went over.
That was fantastic, Shannon. Does anybody have a question for Shannon? Well, I can ask one question. Where you showed I should look this way. You showed a priorities map for your watershed priorities. Do you happen to know the sourcing of how you came up with those priorities?
Yeah, so those were definitely handled more so at the regional level. So if you want really specific like kind of methodology or approach, I would definitely reach out to our fish passage coordinators in the region, Kathy Bozek and Jessica Hogriff or Justin Chiat, who's acting for her right now. But for the most part, as I'm aware, it really used kind of a lot of available spatial data on ranges and habitat quality for a variety of priority species. So not just driven by brook trout, but several other species that are prioritized within the region, as well as some of the kind of community co-benefits that are provided. And as far as I'm aware, both of the maps were really, kind of developed collaboratively with field staff, regional staff, and partner input across the board. So that's kind of my high level awareness, but I'd be happy to get more info if you'd like.
No, that was great. Thanks. And Will, do you have something to add to that? Yeah, Will,
yeah, Will should answer that question.
So yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and we could probably spend all day talking about that too. But Yeah, it's a combination of scientific data and expertise. We reached out to partners in the state to get us some additional input. And it covers a broader range of species than just brook trout. So that's why it looks like a mosaic of places to meet multiple different needs. And certainly would be happy to answer any questions about that.
Well, you'll have a chance to discuss it in about an hour. In about an hour. So, thank you so much, Shannon.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Thanks, everyone.
For being here.